Yeah, good evening to everyone. So just a reminder of what we spoke about. We were discussing Yeshayahu's prophecy in chapter 2, and basically we saw that Yeshayahu made some very clear references to the prohibitions that we find to the king in the book of Devarim, primarily the three main prohibitions of not having an excess of horses, not having an excess of gold and silver, and not having an excess of wives. And we saw that there was also a reference, as the Radak wrote, to the times of Shlomo HaMelech, that Shlomo transgressed these three prohibitions. And what we started to do was to try to analyze what is behind those three prohibitions and how it ties into Yeshayahu's time, which is much later than Shlomo HaMelech, during the times of the king Uzziah. So just before we get back into that again, I just want to show you some of the statements that Chazal said regarding Shlomo HaMelech when he had done what he had done. Very critical of Shlomo HaMelech's behavior in this. So let's just see that to start with, and then we'll get back into what we started to last time, how it ties into what is the deeper meaning here and how it ties into the times of Uzziah. So this is what we saw. Okay, so I brought your, I mean, there's many sources on this on Chazal. I just brought two midrashim that describe what Shlomo HaMelech had done. So one we find in the Midrash Tanchuma, that it says here, Ktiv lo yarbe lo susim velo yashiv, וכתיב היו לו 40,000 רבות סוסים. כתיב לא ירבה לו נשים, וכתיב היו לו 700 נשים. וכתיב וכסף וזהב לא הרבה מאוד, וכתיב ויתן המלך את הכסף בירושלים כאבנים ולא יהיו נגנבות. In other words, what this Midrash is trying to describe, and then it goes on to continue to critique Shlomo, is how each one of these prohibitions that we find regarding the king, Shlomo HaMelech transgressed them. So it says not to have an excess of horses. He had 40,000 urvot susim, stables of horses. It says not to have an excess of wives. It says he had 700 wives. And actually, additionally, as we'll see, he also had an additionally 300 concubines. It says kesef v'zahav lo yarbe lo meod, and we see that Shlomo HaMelech, money in Yerushalayim could be left around like stones and it will not be stolen. In other words, they were so rich. Another Midrash also sort of describes the logic of Shlomo in doing this. על שלמה, כיצד? כשנתן הקדוש ברוך הוא תורה לישראל, נתן בה מצוות עשה, מצוות לא תעשה. Right, so we know Hashem gave Torah to Am Yisrael. There are what we call מצוות עשה, positive commandments, and מצוות לא תעשה, negative prohibitions. ונתן למלך מקצת מצוות, and a few מצוות are specific to a king. שנאמר, לא ירבה לו סוסים וכסף וזהב, ולא ירבה לו נשים ולא יסרו לבבו. Right, the prohibitions to the king. עמד שלמה המלך והחכים על גזירתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא. Okay, Shlomo HaMelech tried to be clever in regarding these prohibitions. ואמר, למה אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא לא ירבה לו נשים? בשביל שלא יסור לבבו. אני ארבה וליבי לא יסור. Okay, so the thinking of Shlomo was, what is the problem with having many wives? That they might turn your heart away from Hashem. You know, I have complete faith, I'm strong in my faith. Ani arbe, I will have many wives, velibi lo yasur, and my heart will not go astray. אמרו רבותינו באותה שעה עלתה יוד שבירבה, ונשתתך לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא. ואמרה ריבון העולמים, לא כך אמרת, אין אות בטלה מן התורה לעולם. Okay, so Chazal here make it a very figurative description that the yud from the letter yud from the word yarbe, in other words, lo yarbe lo nashim, came up and went before God and said, you promised that not a single word from the Torah will ever be canceled out or erased. Right? But Shlomo is canceling out because he says, even though the Torah said lo yarbe lo nashim, which includes the letter yud, I am the first letter in that word. I can do it, and I will not it won't lead me to the problematic behavior that we're concerned about. So, בשם היום יבטל אחת ולמחר אחרת עד שתתבטל כל התורה כולה. Right? If you keep going in this fashion, you could end up, canceling out the entire Torah, because you'll say, oh, this is only prohibited for this reason, I could do it in this way, etc., etc. There's no end to it. אמר לה הקדוש ברוך הוא, שלמה ואלף כיוצא בו יהיו בטלין, וקוצה ממך איני מבטל. In other words, I prefer to have Shlomo HaMelech being sort of canceled out or erased rather than to have even kutza. Kutza is referring to, when we write a yud in the Sefer Torah, we sort of have a little, there's a question whether it's referring to the top sort of spike that we do or the bottom spike that we do on the yud. But that's called, the expression is called kutzo shel yud. It's like the very, very slight detail in the shape of the yud. So even that, I'm not willing to give up that even a kutzo shel yud, even just the spike of the yud, of the letter yud in the Torah, that shall be erased. Machtiv bey, how did it end up? Vayiled ziknat Shlomo l'shav ituv et levavo. Right, Shlomo was not successful, and ultimately the women did cause his heart to go astray. Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, noach lo leShlomo שיהיה גורף ביבין שלא נכתב עליו המקרא הזה. In other words, Shlomo HaMelech would have rather been set to work, goref bivin, that's the people who clean out the sewers. Okay, he would have preferred to have to go work in cleaning out sewers in all that filth, rather than to have this verse in the Tanakh written upon him about how the women had led him astray. Okay, so we see that Chazal described this very clearly, how Shlomo HaMelech, even though he realized that these Isurim in the Torah existed, he somehow thought that he would be able to have an excess of horses, women, whatever it is, without the problematic consequences that would come by them. But ultimately, he was not successful in doing so, and the pitfalls that are caused by these prohibitions, ultimately he came to them as well. Okay, so what's interesting about this, besides the very descriptive explanation of what happened with Shlomo in this situation, is that really we see that the prohibitions here, they're set out to prevent certain consequences. In other words, certain results that can come about. If you have too much women, it will lead your heart astray. If you have too much horses, etc., or too much gold and silver. Okay, so in other words, these are prohibitions that are coming to prevent other things from happening. In other words, it could be that on their own, just on their own, they're not themselves intrinsically problematic, but they are coming to prevent, a result that will come about from it. Now, how does this tie into Uzziah? So I think generally the claim that I would like to make is as follows, that theoretically you could somehow, and this is a concept that we find often, theoretically somehow you could do similar things to these prohibitions. It could be that you're not doing precisely what the Torah prohibited, as a king I'm speaking, but you could do similar things which ultimately will lead you down the same road. So even though technically you might not be transgressing these prohibitions, in essence, what you're doing is the same because the results are going to be the same, okay? So the first example that we spoke about last time was the horses, okay? And what is the whole horses about? So I'll just remind you briefly what we said last time. We said basically that when you have an army with a lot of horses, what does that require? We discussed that there are two ways, and we see this in Tanakh as well, and we know it also from today's modern day armies, that we see that you can have two types of armies. You can have an army which is a very large regular army where the soldiers are full-time soldiers all year long. Like, for example, I think the Syrian army works that way, at least when it still used to exist. I don't know that much about armies around the world. I just remember from my time in army training when they explained to us about at least the neighboring armies around Israel. But at least at that time, there was a Syrian army to speak of, and they didn't have reserve units. It was just a very big full-time army, all soldiers worked served as soldiers year long. Then you have, so that's one type of army that you can have. Another type of army is more like the IDF, where you have smaller regular army, but I'm just muting everybody so that there are no noises, but if you want to speak up, please unmute. So where you have a smaller regular army, but you have a lot of reserve units that you can call into action when there's a need, when there's a time of war. And we saw that that was a system that David HaMelech used, that he had reserve units that would serve a month a year. And we also saw that, if he had a problem, if it wasn't a big problem, he would send out Yoav with all the professional soldiers, the soldiers who were there full time. Once, the situation escalated, then he would call all the reserve units and the entire army would get together and go to war. And that's the way the IDF does it to this day. So where do the horses tie into this? The horses, they are essentially require full-time soldiers. You cannot have reserve units with horses because the horses require constant training and they require a connection between the horse and the rider. They have to be very much in sync when you take the horses out to battle. And we know, for example, that they would often do the armies with the horses, so they would sort of practice all year long by hunting with the horses. And that was sort of their way of training and getting ready for battle. And when they would go to battle, they would be ready with the horses. The problem with that, what's the problem with having a very big regular army? So we mentioned a few problems. First of all, people who are in the army, they're not at home. So they're not with their families. They're not with their communities. So ultimately, it will lead to a spiritual decline. Now, you could say, well, we need an army. Granted, you need an army, so there is no choice. And you have to take sort of this spiritual, moral hit due to the army. It's a necessary evil, so to speak, until we have Yeshayahu's first prophecy of world peace. But until that time, it's a necessary evil. But again, it depends on what scale you do it. If you can do it with reserve units, where people are only spending a month a year, or most people, and only a smaller group are full-time army soldiers, then that sort of hit that you're taking is less severe than if you have a very, very large amount of people who are all year long, all their lives, or a good bulk of their lives, detached from the families, from the communities, from the elders, from the spiritual leaders. So that's one problem that you have with a very big regular army. Second problem we spoke about is that maintenance of a regular army requires a lot of money. So then you get into the other prohibition that you have to amount lots of gold and silver to be able to fund your very big regular army, as opposed to reserve units, which are cheaper. In other words, you have to have supplies ready for them, and you have to maybe support them for the month, a year that they're working, that they're coming to the army or whatever it is. But obviously that's much less cheaper than having them as full-time soldiers. And third point that we saw, and this is alluded to by Yeshayahu himself, and we know in the book of Tehillim and in other places, that having too strong an army with horses ultimately leads people to have more faith in their own powers rather than in Hashem. And in a sort of backwards logic, we would think it might be better to have a less powerful army that requires you to believe in Hashem rather than having a more powerful army, which could lead you to the thought of, that we have the powers and we need Hashem. This is a similar situation, if you remember, to the story that we had regarding Uziah's father, Amaziah. If you remember, this is what we started when we started learning Yeshayahu, in the background to Yeshayahu, that he was going to go to war, and he hired a whole lot of mercenaries. And Amos, Yeshayahu's father, told him, no, send those mercenaries back, go with a smaller army, okay? And he showed faith, he went with a smaller army, and he prevailed, okay? This also ties in, we have Hanukkah upcoming. So if you read, for example, the book of the Maccabim, I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to read it. The book of the Maccabites, I haven't read all of it, but I've read parts of it It's incredibly powerful, especially, I think it was in the first book, when they're describing how they went to war against the Greeks, and they just had tremendous faith, even though they were outnumbered, but just the faith that drove them, allowed them to prevail, even though they were certainly undermanned and underhanded against the Yevanim. Okay, so that's something very powerful when you go to war, or we can give endless examples of it. David and Goliath, right? David and Goliath. Goliath clearly had the upper hand, and he somewhat ridiculed David, and David came with just the belief that that he could do it, and he did it. And we could give modern examples. If you compare Israel in the 6-day war versus the Yom Kippur war, feeling that you're too strong and too cocky, okay, can have a very, very negative effect, okay, in general, and specifically also when it comes to not putting your faith in the hands of Hashem. So that's the problem with horses, okay? How does this tie into with having a very big army? How does this tie into Uziyahu? So we said last time it ties in well, because even though Uziyahu might not have technically had a lot of horses, when we read the psukim describing his army, there weren't a lot of horses there. It doesn't say that there were horses, but he had a huge regular army. I think the number was over 300,000 soldiers, which for a country that size at that time was a huge amount for a regular army. So even though he might not have technically transgressed the prohibition in the sense of horses, he was actually transgressing what's behind the prohibition, and that is having a very huge regular army, which ultimately leads to all these problems. It leads to the problems of you have a lot of soldiers away from home, that you need a lot of money to pay for it, and that you will believe in your own might rather than put your trust in the hands of Hashem. Okay, so essentially, what Yeshayahu is trying to say: our land is filled with horses, even though it might not be horses. And what the idea of the horses is, and that's how it ties into the times of Uziyahu. He's saying essentially what happened in the times of Shlomo is now happening again. Okay, so that is regarding the horses. Any questions or comments on that before we continue to the next prohibition? Okay, so let's go on now to the prohibition of too many wives. What is the prohibition of too many wives about? And again, as I keep saying, we'll have to see how this ties into Uziyahu. So let's see what happened in the time of Shlomo HaMelech with all these wives. So it says in the book of Melachim 1, Kings 1, chapter 11. והמלך שלמה אהב נשים נוכריות רבות, ואת בת פרעה מואביות, עמוניות, אדומיות, סידוניות, חיתיות. King Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Phoenician, and Hittite women. מן הגויים אשר אמר השם אל בני ישראל לא תבוא בהם והם לא יבואו בכם, אכן יטו את לבבכם אחרי אלוהים, בהם דבק שלמה לאהבה. From the nations of which the Lord had said to the Israelites, none of you shall join them and none of them shall join you, lest they turn your heart away to follow their gods. Such Solomon clung to and loved. ויהי לו נשים שרות 700 ופילגשים 300 ויטו נשיו את ליבו. Okay, he had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Kings had this concept of concubines, which were certainly sort of like wives. In other words, they could only be with the king, they couldn't be with anybody else, but they sort of didn't have the same stature as a royal wife. They had a lower level stature in their relationship with the king, in the king's court. ויהי לעת זקנת שלמה, נשב והיטו את לבבו אחרי אלוהים אחרים, ולא היה לבבו שלם עם אדוני אלוהיו כלבב דוד אביו. In his old age, his wives turned Solomon's heart after other gods, and he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord as his God as his father David had been. וילך שלמה אחרי השטרות אלוהי הצידונים, ואחרי מלכם שיקוץ המונים. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Phoenicians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. והיה שלמה הרע בעיני אדוני ולא מילא אחרי אדוני כדוד אביו. Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal to the Lord like his father David. אז יבנה שלמה במה לכמוש שיקוץ מואב בהר אשר על פני ירושלים, ולמולך שיקוץ בני ענון. At that time, Solomon built a shrine for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill near Jerusalem, and one for the Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. וכן עשה לכל נשיו הנוכריות מקטירות ומזבחות לאלוהיהן. And he did the same for all his foreign wives who offered and sacrificed to their gods. ויתנף אדוני בשלמה כי נטה לבבו מעם אדוני אלוהי ישראל הנראה אליו פעמיים. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice. וציווה אליו על הדבר הזה לבלתי לכת אחרי אלוהים אחרים ולא שמר את אשר ציווה אדוני. And commanded him about this matter not to follow other gods. He did not obey what the Lord had commanded. Okay, so these verses, very, very difficult to read, very painful. You know, this is Shlomo HaMelech, you know, the son of David, the one who built the Beit HaMikdash. Very, very difficult verses to read about him. According to Chazal, these verses are actually being harsh with him because maybe he did not actually worship, did not build these altars, but simply allowed these things to happen, to being done by his wives. But clearly we see the very difficult results of what he had done. So what's going on here? What was this about? Why was he marrying all these women from all these nations? Like we said, the daughter of Pharaoh, mentioned here, so many nations, Moabiyot, Ammoniyot, Edomiyot, Sidoniyot, Chidiyot. All these are nations that were surrounding the kingdom of Yehuda at that time. So what's going on here? So, as we know, and I think we've discussed in the past, the way foreign relations were done in those times were through, and even till modern times in some places, were through marriages. So essentially when you would marry another king's daughter, that was sort of the way that you would make a treaties with him. In other words, you would make the bond a very powerful bond through the marriage between the two royal houses. And there would be many ramifications for this. Usually what was done is that the more powerful king would take the daughter of the less powerful king in the treaties. And that's what's very interesting, that we see the great power of Shlomo, that he even married the daughter of Pharaoh. In other words, he had the upper hand against the Pharaoh in Egypt. I think we mentioned in the past that the Egyptians have this tradition that they pride in, the ancient Egyptians, that the daughter of Pharaoh was never given to another king. But this recording in the Tanakh regarding Shlomo at least contradicts that on that instance. But we see the idea that of how the marriage was done for foreign relations. The problem with this is, what's the problem? The problem is that anytime you're creating diplomatic relations with other nations, in essence, you're opening yourselves to their influences, okay? So you're taking their wives. It's not just the wives. In other words, you're opening it up to, wait, let me see, there's oh, okay, I'll take a look at this afterwards. I'll take a look at that soon, the comment in the chat, okay? So it says that, in essence, you're opening up yourself to another culture, and they can have an influence on your culture. In essence, by Shlomo creating these diplomatic relations through these marriages with all these other nations, bringing these women who were representatives of these other nations. Again, these women were all princesses, all daughters of kings. They would probably bring in with them, you know, their servants and whoever it was. You were opening yourself up to relations. So there was travel, business going in out between these two countries. So in essence, you're exposing yourself to another culture which could have negative influences, okay? And that's the problem of lo yarbelo nashim, okay? In other words, it's not saying that you can't have wives at all. In other words, a king obviously has to have wives. He has to have, you do need diplomatic relations with other countries, but you cannot overdo it, because if you overdo it, you open yourself up too much with these diplomatic relations with other countries, then in essence, you're exposing yourself to these other cultures. You're allowing these other cultures into your nation, and they will bring in their idolatrous behaviors and ultimately deteriorate your own society. Okay, so that's essentially what happened with Shlomo. He had a great, the kingdom was very successful, and part of that success was all these diplomatic relations that he built in with these other nations, but ultimately it allowed the beliefs and the idolatrous behaviors of these other nations to penetrate, and then had a very negative effect on his kingdom. And that's why we have these very harsh words in the Tanakh about it. Now, he was sure that he could do it without allowing these cultures to penetrate, but he was not successful. How does this all tie into Uzziah? Let me just take a look at the note of the chat here. Just 1 second, I'll see what this is about. Shalom, I mentioned another reference. Right, that's in the book of Shmuel. That's sort of, he was trying, Shmuel at the time was trying to discourage them from taking a king because of, the different rights that a king could have, that he could take a people and he could draft people and take daughters, etc. Maybe clarify the reference and how this connects to what we were discussing. Okay, I don't know. All right, hopefully it'll clarify. Okay, let's go on to to see how this connects to King Uzziah.
Diane,
yeah.
May I ask you a question? I know everybody knows this, that the reason why Shlomo HaMelech did these averos, these transgressions, is because Hashem gave him a reason. He gave him actually a reason. The Torah never gives a reason. It says doesn't very often give a reason. I don't want to waste your time. But here he was given a reason why you should turn you astray, why you go down to Egypt, and so on and so forth. My question to you is, it's such a sad thing when you read this, is had Hashem not given him a reason, just said, don't have too many wives, don't have too many horses, do you think Shlomo HaMelech might then have listened? It was only because he was rationalizing it because of his wisdom. Or did Hashem give it him on purpose that he told him the reasons why? I've never had an answer to that.
I don't know that I can give you an answer. What would have happened had it not been written that way? You're right that Chazal do bring out that message, that it's sort of, why does the Torah not usually tell us the reasons behind the prohibitions? It's because if we'll know the reasons, then we'll make excuses as to not to observe them. And sort of the example for that is Shlomo HaMelech, even though he was the wisest of all men, the most righteous king. But once he was told the reason, then he thought he could be more clever, and ultimately he failed. So that's certainly the message that we can learn out from here, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, how does this tie into Uzziah? So we don't find anywhere that it says that Uzziah had many wives. Wait, sorry, I shared the wrong screen here, apologies. We don't find that it says on Uzziah that he had too many wives. However, we do find that he had extensive diplomatic relations with the nations surrounding him. Okay? ויתנו ההמונים מנחה לעוזיהו, וילך שמו עד לבוא מצרים, כי החזיק עד למעלה. So we find that the Ammonites, this is in the Divrei Amim, the book of Chronicles, that's where we have most of the information on Uzziah. So the Ammonites paid tribute to Uzziah, and his fame spread to the approaches of Egypt, for he grew exceedingly strong. So we see here that Uzziah, his fame and connections extended all the way to Egypt, which reminds us of Shlomo. And also says, "Vayas b'Yerushalayim cheshbonot machshevet choshev להיות על המגדלים ועל הפינות לירות בחיצים ובאבנים גדולות, ויצא שמו עד למרחוק, כי הפליא לעזרת כי חזק. He made clever devices in Jerusalem, set on the towers and the corners for shooting arrows and large stones. His fame spread far, for he was helped wonderfully, and he became strong. So we see again here, again, he wasn't deploying horses. He had this other military technology, but what it brought about was ויצא שמו עד למרחוק. In other words, his fame spread far. So apparently, during the times of Uzziah, we had again a similar situation to Shlomo. So even though, and we'll see soon see other proofs for this as well, but that even though he didn't necessarily have too many wives, but nevertheless he was engaging in relations with many, many other countries. We see that even countries very far away heard his name, probably wanted to buy some of his military technology, whatever it was, and take part in his success. And that again, even though it's not technically transgressing the prohibition of having too many wives, it's transgressing the essence of the prohibition, and that is the prohibition of opening up yourselves too much to these foreign cultures, more than that is necessary, you know, for basic and good survival, and in essence allowing other cultures to penetrate and influence your society. Okay, so that's the second prohibition of the wives. The third prohibition is not having too much gold and silver. Why is this prohibited? So basically, what's the problem? What's the problem with with having too much gold and silver? So I think it ties into two of the other prohibitions that we spoke about. First of all, how can you amass a very large amount of gold and silver? How is that possible for a country to become that wealthy? It doesn't happen based on just internal commerce. A country can never be exceedingly wealthy just on what it has on its own. It always requires international commerce. That's what really can make a country wealthy above and beyond the norm. So again, having too much gold and silver, how do you amass large amounts of gold and silver? In essence, it connects to the other prohibition of having too many wives, because in essence, it necessitates engaging in a lot of international commerce. Engaging in international commerce means having relations with other countries. It means merchants traveling to those other countries. When merchants are traveling to those other countries, they're away from their homes, they're away from their communities, and they're exposed to these other cultures, and they're being influenced by them. And when these merchants come back home, they're bringing from them those influences that they were influenced by while they were away. And we also have merchants from those countries coming into your own country to do business. Okay, that's what lo yarbe lo kesef v'zahav. So lo yarbe lo kesef v'zahav is also connected to the idea of having too many wives, in the sense of being foreign influences into your country. Additionally, it also ties into the horses in the sense of having too much faith in your own power, because you have all this wealth. And again, it leads you to trust more in you. You built all this wealth, you amassed all this wealth by engaging in all this business and commerce. And it again puts your faith in your own powers rather than in the hands of Hashem. So really, all these three prohibitions, okay, so I have a question here in the chat, a very good question. If that is the interpretation, would that not amount to isolating Israel or confining Israel within its geography, somewhat disconnected from the nation? In essence, yes. I mean, the question is, the difficult part of this is, what is too much, okay? Because obviously, when it says lo yarbe lo nashim, but a certain amount is permitted. Like for example, specifically by wives, Chazal told us that you are permitted to have 18, okay? We're talking about a king, not a private individual, okay? So clearly a king is allowed to engage still in a significant amount of diplomatic relations. Okay, again, you do need a certain amount of horses for your army. You do need a certain amount of gold and silver to run your country. So what is that balance? But you have to find that balance, okay? So on the one hand, we're not telling you to be, I don't think the commandment here is to be like, let's say, North Korea, where you're completely isolated for the world, despite the fact that they do have the advantage of probably not having any influences of other cultures. But it clearly leads you to, can have some very, very harmful effects. So we're not talking about that extreme. On the other hand, you have to realize that you are paying a price by opening up yourself too much on these points, and it will lead you down the road. Now, when things are going well, it's very hard to stop that, as of what happened in the times of Shlomo, and as what happened in the times of David. So you have to find that balance. What is the amount that is necessary that will build up your state to be a good one, but on the other hand, not to overdo it and overly expose yourself to these other cultures. Okay, how to make that balance? I don't know, but again, I'm not applying for the office of king, so I can speak about it theoretically rather than how to implement it properly. So, but getting back to here, just to sort of tie it all together, all these prohibitions are really connected one to the other, because ultimately it's all about not becoming too powerful, okay, which could lead you to believe too much in your own might. Also about not exposing yourself to other cultures, because these are what all these things are about. The horses, again, the big regular army, requires a lot of money. A lot of money requires international commerce. International commerce requires diplomatic relations with other cultures, leaving away from your home, bringing in these other cultures, and that's ultimately what will deteriorate, the proper society as viewed by the Torah, as viewed here by the prophet Yeshayahu. Okay, how do we see the masses of riches in the times of Uzziah? So we see that as well in Divrei Yamim. Okay, it says here, Vayiven migdalim b'midbar, vayachtzov borot rabim, ki mikne rab hayalo ubashfela ubamishor, ikarim vechormim beharim uvakarmel ki ohev adama haya. Okay, so he built towers in the wilderness and hoed out many cisterns, for he had much cattle, and farmers in the foothills and on the plain, and vine dressers in the mountains and on fertile lands, for he loved the soil. Now, does anybody remember? We discussed this verse already somewhere in the beginning of our lectures. Does anybody remember what these towers and the cisterns in the wilderness were about? We spoke about this. Does anybody remember what these towers were for? What did they serve?
Was it protection?
The lookouts.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. It was lookouts on what? What did we have in the Midbar?
Because of worrying enemies approaching or whatever.
No, but who specifically would travel in the desert?
Oh, the nomads.
Merchants.
Merchants, exactly. That was a very well-known merchant route that went through the southern desert of Israel, going down to Egypt, and then going up north, leading all the way up to Mesopotamia, ultimately. Okay? And Yeshayahu secured these commercial routes by building towers that essentially prevented robbers, and also the cisterns obviously providing drinking water for all these merchants traveling through. So that would engage a very serious international commercial line going through the land of Israel, and again, bringing these influences. Another point, I didn't bring it here in the sources, but I think we may have discussed in the past, that Uzziah built two very important port cities.
Yeah, in Eilat.
One was in Eilat, right down south by the Red Sea, and the other one in Ashdod. Ashdod is a port city on the Mediterranean. Today it's also a very important, probably Israel's biggest port. What is the point of those ports? Those ports allow for what's called Sovev Africa. It's a sea route that goes around Africa. This is before the Suez Canal was created to cut through. So you could I don't know where you would start and where you would end, but you could, let's say, start from Ashdod and go on a trip all around Africa and then come back from the bottom of Africa, going up and reach Eilat, okay? I think it's described in Shlomo Melech's time, they also had this, and I think it was described as a 3-year trip, okay? So it's obviously, economically, it's very successful to be able to have these 2 port cities and to be able to do business with all the countries in Africa. We're talking about the countries that border the Mediterranean, going down south by what today we call South Africa, coming back up again. It's tremendous economically, but if you think about these merchants, they are going to be 3 years away from their homes. That was approximately what the trip took back then. And they would be bringing in, ultimately to Israel, all the influences of all the countries that they would be doing business with along the way. So essentially, we have here Uzziah also on the Lo Yarbelo Kesef Ezav, again, engaging in these. On the one hand, he was building up the land of Israel, but on the other hand, he was bringing in all these negative influences, plus the belief in his own power. And that's what we see where did Uzziah's downfall come about? We see here the verse in Divrei Yamim. It says, "Ukechezkato gava libo ad laashchit, vayim'al ba'Adonai Elohav, vayavo el echad Adonai laktir al mizbach haktoret." When he was strong, he grew so arrogant and he acted corruptly. He trespassed against his God by entering the temple of the Lord to offer incense on the incense altar. So ultimately, after all this, it becomes the same old story, right? What we spoke about, why are all these prohibitions for the king? Ultimately, we saw in the book of Dvarim, the bottom line was, we don't want his heart to go haughty. We don't want him to believe too much in his own power and his own might. And that's ultimately what occurred to Uzziah as well. After all his success, and after though he started out as a righteous king, eventually this is what his success led to believe too much is in his own power. And therefore, the response of Hashem is now to squash man's power. As we saw, that's what Yeshayahu describes. The humbling of man will now take place as a result of all of this. Okay, anybody have any questions or comments on this? Okay, all right, very good. So, yeah, Flora.
Can you just remind, when Uzziah offered the incense, did he actually offer it? Was it something to do with his wives? I'm confused, I've forgotten now. Did he actually offer it in the attic? Was he the one who did it in the attic? Was he the king who offered the incense in the attic?
In the Kodesh HaKodeshim, he went into the Beit HaMikdash.
Then I'm getting muddled up with another king. Okay, thank you.
No, he also did to Hashem. He wasn't worshipping idols. It wasn't that.
No.
But he was not a Kohen, and he was
not. He wasn't a Kohen.
That's the one.
I thought there was
Yeah, we didn't get into the issue of why he did that. What was he thinking when he did it? Clearly, there was something to what he had done. We haven't discussed it at all yet. Maybe at some point we will. Try to explain what Uzziah was thinking was. But the main point, that the Tanakh seems to focus on is that he came to that mistake, whatever it was, because of Kechizkato, because he had become too powerful. That's what led him to that error.
Right. No, I don't want to waste your time, but I thought there was a king who offered the incense in an attic, and again, it was to do with his was it Azariah and Uzziah were the same, weren't they?
Yeah, Uzziah and Azariah.
Yeah. So then I must be muddling. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So what we'll do next week, we'll try to finish up. We still have one more section in chapter 2. So we'll do that next week, and then I think after that we have a bit of a vacation for Hanukkah and the winter vacation, and then we'll pick up again in January. But next week we're on, and we'll try to finish up chapter 2.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you to everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.